Good afternoon, everyone. For our next talk, I'd like to present Lloyd Evans, presenting on From Passwords to Passwordless, a use case for passkeys in a new GenAI world. Please make him feel welcome.
Oh, thanks very much. Just a quick background on me. So 7 years at LastPass, head of identity for about 3. I've got a background in finance. I've sort of come from a finance risk perspective and probably 10 or so years in software and cybersecurity more broadly. Before we kick off, just a quick show of hands. Who has passwords here? Okay, good. We're in the right room. Perfect. So what are we going to talk about today? Generally, this presentation that I provide is more sort of a holistic view of what's happening from cybersecurity, but also around passwords and what's driving that change from passwords to passkeys and the reasons why we want to move towards that. We'll give a little bit of flavour. If there are any questions, again, at the end of the talk, happy to answer them, LastPass specific or about the presentation, and the team will be at the booth later on giving out free passes for LastPass for personal use if you want to go past and say good day. So regional trends we will get to shortly, but this is pretty common for us. Bad passwords happen to good people. We know that. The amount of CEOs and executives I talk to that either have had their LinkedIn password popped and they've used it for their AD credentials is pretty common. And the problem is steeped in history. Like if you go back to Spartan days, they were using passwords to get into effectively their military, right? So it's pretty common practice for using passwords from a security standpoint. Regional trends, I'm just going to click through this because it's kind of the same thing. What have we started to see? So if you go back, let's say 6 years, 7 years when I first started, yes, people knew about passwords. Most of it was sort of like 8-character passwords. And over time, within the region, so this is APAC specific, India, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, we've seen a heightened increase in regulatory push, both from the government perspective, but also from privacy standpoint. So OAC, Office of the Information Commissioner, produces a notable data breach report, and that's been going for since 2018, I think. And consistently without fail, that report shows that about 60% of data breaches or cyber incidents in this country, in Australia, relate to compromised credentials. So it's not us saying that, that's a government. If you go across the ditch to New Zealand, similar sort of thing. Certainly New Zealand has a similar type of statistic. And so it's kind of two-pronged. We've seen governments push down from a privacy control perspective. We went from Essential 4 to Essential 8. And we also see our friends and colleagues here at the ACSC, ASD providing guidance around the use of password managers as well, which has sort of increased over time since at least when I started here. And that was part of the reason why I joined LastPass initially, was I could see the problem in the market and to be able to help people, all walks of life, all backgrounds, to help manage credentials more effectively, because there wasn't really a good way to do it when I started way back when. Again, this is just a snippet from the OAC report. Again, I've followed that report since 2018 and consistently without fail. They originally produced this report every quarter. It's now moved to every 6 months, and it's common, right? If you look at the statistics, it's phishing, it's compromised credentials, it's brute force, and interestingly, ransomware, albeit that it's impactful, is only like 30%, right, of all the cyber incidents that have happened as part of the NDB report. So again, interesting statistic, not from us, it's from the government, and definitely worth having a look at. Friends at IBM, so they again produce a report. It sort of highlights the fact that credentials are the leading cause of data breaches globally, and most common TTP. It's also the longest dwell time to resolve the issue. And so, the common phrase that we have internally is that criminals aren't hacking in, they're just logging in, right? They're just getting known credentials, brute forcing or sending a dodgy link and getting you to enter your password in to effectively gain access to your environment. So again, this report is good in the sense that it's quite extensive. I think it's about 3,800 companies globally. And the dwell time there is probably the biggest problem I see. So dwell time, if you're not familiar with it, is effectively a criminal coming into your environment and poking around and having a look. And as per IBM, it's 237 days. So that's effectively like someone breaking into your house, going through your cupboards, sitting down having dinner with you, and you not knowing that they're there for like a year. It's kind of a problem, right? So dwell time's a problem, and we can continue to see that as a risk moving forward. And the other component to this is the cost. The rectification of an attack through brute force or compromised credential is the most expensive. IBM's pegged it at $4.5 million US. I think for Australia, based on the report, it's probably a bit less than that, maybe 3, but it's still extensive. And the reason for that is the cleanup, right? Once they're in, you've got to then figure out, well, how did they get in? How long have they been in the environment for? And not just common here in Australia. Like if you look at the Colonial Pipeline breach, the SolarWinds breach, both of those happened through credential loss, right? That's how they got into the environment in the first place, and they were obviously pretty extensive problems. Pervasive password problem, 8 billion people in the world. There's about 300 billion credentials in circulation today. About 64% of people use the internet. Not everyone uses the internet. And on average, it's like 58 passwords per person. Again, depending on the report, it could be more, could be less, but we've probably pegged it slightly higher than that, mainly because the rate of app use, website use is increasing exponentially, and all of those apps, websites are still effectively hard-coded with username password sets, right? We're not really shifting away from that in the short term. Big problem. We're obviously moving towards passwordless. There's been a lot of talk around passkeys. Our good friends at Google are obviously supporting it. If you don't know Ben, it's worth having a chat to. And passkeys are kind of the future, right? But the problem that exists is that passwords still have a very long tail, extremely long. The Lindy effect, which is on the screen there, is actually a term that was coined by Nassim Taleb, so author, which is basically talking about that if something exists for a period of time, it's likely to continue into the future. And so if it's had a long history, like passwords have, they were created in the 1960s, it is likely to continue into the future, right? There's a sort of a cliff, right, that we've got to get past to move towards passkeys. So yeah, 1960 to now, still a stack of credentials that we need to deal with, and hopefully we'll get to that, but let's see. So Fernando Cabado, professor at MIT, actually created the first credential. It was for a database. He just didn't want people to get into it. Again, fast forward to now, 300 billion credentials in circulation, and we all deal with it, right? At the start of the presentation, everyone's got a password, right? Even if we use Face ID or Touch ID to get into your phone, every single app underlying that still requires username, password fields. You need to reset a credential. It's still the same problem, right? It's still sort of hard coded into that. Sort of fast forward 1990s, SSO, uses of SSO to sort of effectively aggregate credentials, the use of MFA and those type of things to try and reduce the burden of credentials, sort of helped, but it's kind of like you're dealing with the symptom, not the cause, right? And despite the use of SSO and MFA, if you go back to the OAC statistics that we've produced before by the government, we're still seeing like 60% of the data breaches happening through credentials, right? So although SSO helps from a UX perspective, criminals, threat groups are still gaining access to environments through credentials and bypassing it, moving laterally, right? Password experience, we kind of get that now. Windows Hello is an example, is a good item there. Obviously Face ID, Touch, those type of things are also good from a UX standpoint, but again, they're kind of symptom, not cause. And as we obviously move into this year and then a future state is passkeys. How familiar are people with passkeys? Have you heard of them? Maybe just quick show of hands. Know what they're about? Obviously Ben does, so that's good. Yeah, okay, so mixed. Personally, being in this space for as long as I have, I'm super bullish on passkeys, I'll be honest. Both from a security standpoint, but also user experience. I think it's kind of the future and future state we're going to get to, but there is quite a bit to get through to get to that point. The great decoupling, as I've sort of referred to it as, is effectively moving away from username and password sets being developed in apps and websites and moving to effectively the use of passkeys, right, to be able to code against that website or app to do that. And that's probably that's a snippet of the code base that has to happen as part of that. So if you think about it, 300 billion credentials, we've got to effectively rewrite most of that to allow for passkeys moving forward. And passkeys, so the way I sort of view it, I sit on the FIDO board, which is for APAC, and it's effectively going to go consumer-led first, right? Consumers will get used to it. It's about half the room kind of know about passkeys, and effectively that'll flip into enterprise over time. I think at last count, there's probably about 150 services that support passkeys today. And if I look back at, say, September, October last year, there was about 80. So it's moving pretty quickly, but probably not that fast enough, right, given the amount of breaches we're still having through credentials. Again, if you're not sure the difference between what a password is, what a passkey is, I say in maths we trust, because effectively what it is, it's just a math equation, right? It's you own the private key, the public key sits with the other provider, be it Google, whoever it might be, and that math equation, or the public-private key pairing, is what actually auths you. So rather than you having to use username password, you're effectively using your private key. And then it becomes an issue around where do you store it, how do you store it, how do you manage it. The other thing that tends to come up for us is like when we speak at these type of events, or we're just talking one-on-one with a customer, and we're talking about broader strategies for passwordless, there's still quite a lot of confusion, right? A lot of people don't really either have it nailed down or it's sort of broad, right? A lot of people, when they talk about passwordless, it's really just like, oh, like my phone, where I use my face to auth into it, but the apps underneath it still need username and password. So there's a bit of confusion around that. We've actually got a password maturity model, which I'll show later on. So if people want to get a copy of that, just send me a message and happy to share it. It's a free asset that we produced, and it's effectively looking at where a company is on that sort of trajectory towards passkeys, and we sort of map against that. GenAI risk. So we've got a threat intelligence team now as part of our separation out of Go2, or the old Log Me In business, most of which have come from Bank of America, their threat team. We pulled them across as part of the separation. They've produced a whole heap of information around GenAI and blog posts and a whole raft of other things. We have seen a spike in this specifically. One interesting one was actually a deep fake. They had a deep fake of our CEO, a recording, and effectively tried to gain access to our environment through that. And that was just recently. It was pretty sophisticated, and we're starting to see more of that sort of come through. But the LLM side is really thinking about, there's a solution out there called passGPT, which effectively pulls in all known credentials and information through brute force attacks into an LLM and effectively uses it as a brute force mechanism out into an environment. The scariest thing about this is it learns, right? So it effectively goes, okay, admin 123, no, it couldn't get in, and then it will figure out another variation of that credential, right? And it learns as it goes along. So it's pretty sophisticated. I think from memory it's open source, so anyone can kind of pick it up. And so what's the combat against that? Would be twofold. Right now, it's really thinking about how do you automate long, complex passwords today. And the second fold is really thinking about, as you move to passkeys, that effectively negates this type of solution, right? Because they can't brute force a private key at this point. Hopefully they can't in the future either. So that's the thing to think about. Again, worth having a read of some of that information from the Time team. Super intelligent group, probably more intelligent than I am, and definitely worth a read. A good group of guys and women. What else have we been seeing? This was actually produced by our threat team, and effectively it's from the FTC in the US, and it's the rise of email use for attacks, right? So historically it's probably like, hey, we'll phone up and try and spoof our way in. But effectively the use of LLMs and phishing as a service has increased significantly. And as we saw as part of the OAC statistics, since about 2018, about 30% of our attacks or breaches in this country relate to phishing, specifically for credential harvesting, right? So pretty big risk. This is a stat from us, obviously, let's be honest. 46% of people think that password manager is a good place to use to store passwords, obviously, and pass keys moving forward, mainly because it's inoperable, right? You can use a password manager across any system, any device, whereas in some cases, pass keys effectively get stored on the OS environment and not across multiple devices. Okay, I'm going to skip that. And that one. So we spend a lot of time, and I would say probably close to 80% of the time at LastPass is really just on the education piece. So yes, we're a software provider, I get that. We produce like password management, but really most of the work's around education, right? Going into a company and saying, hey, instead of like storing passwords on a Post-it note or a spreadsheet, or on a password manager that was built in Russia, probably better off using something that's a little bit more homegrown, or is IRAP certified, or has storage here locally, kind of thing. The other thing that we spend a lot of time on is really educating people how they use password managers or passwords in general outside of the office. Why do we do that? Because there's an indirect correlation to how people perceive security outside of the office and how it then translates back into the environment itself. So if you're more inclined to use a password manager outside of the office, generally speaking, we get a lot of introductions to businesses through that. The CFO's using it externally, we get pulled in to do it from an enterprise standpoint. If my family's using it, then I'm probably more inclined to have better security posture in the office. And so we do spend a lot of time on that specifically. I will come and do presentations, normally free of cost, like we just come in to do educational sessions. Again, it's agnostic. I'm not talking about LastPass. It's just like use a password manager. It's just good hygiene from a security standpoint, personally, and from a business standpoint as well. Human behavior, bad habits, cognitive dissonance. So we know passwords aren't going away in the short term, 300 billion credentials in circulation, but we know people kind of, not you guys, but just people in general, can be lazy with this type of stuff, right? The thing that bothers me about this statistic, it's a report we produce. We do it each year, Psychology of the Password Report, which is effectively looking at the way humans interact with services like passwords and websites. 45% of people don't change their credential after they've been breached. Right, so the password's gone, they know what it is, and we still don't go through and change it. A lot of that's just down to habit, habit or this perceived notion that nothing's going to happen to me, or this other idea of cognitive dissonance. Like, we know what the right thing to do is, but we just don't do it. Like, yes, I should be getting 8 hours of sleep, but I probably got 6 last night. Those type of things, right? It's just really getting into the habit of people using it. And a lot of the conversations we have is really, post password manager and then after password manager. Like I couldn't live with it without it type of thing. Right? It's really just getting people used to doing that. Again, going back to when I started like 7 years ago, talking about password managers, most people didn't even know what I was talking about. You pick up the phone and be like, hey, do you use one? They're like, what are you talking about? And then sort of fast forward today, like Gartner's obviously come out to use, obviously from a password management perspective, to use workforce password management tools. That's a report that they've obviously produced. This isn't us. Not sponsored by us either, just as an FYI. We didn't give them a whole heap of money for that. They just went and did it themselves. And, passwords are trendy. Another plug for our friends at Google. But again, I like using this chart. I'm very analytical, right? So I don't want to just chuck up a whole stack of stats and you go, yeah, that's great. That's just all LastPass stuff. No, this is like from the internet, right? This is people's search volume of passwords in Australia from 2004 to now, right? So when I was, talking back in 2017, that's probably why people didn't know about it, because no one was searching for it, right? And then you fast forward to today. And I would say mostly and in part is due to the government. They've produced a lot of good resourcing around the use of password managers and the way that security helps. And so big kudos to them as part of that. But again, that's a pretty common trend. I've looked at other different regions, but pretty similar. Claire O'Neill, some people may know her. First cybersecurity minister. Again, start of the year, she pushed out this public LinkedIn note, use a password manager. Again, it's not LastPass saying it, it's the government, our minister. Again, she obviously not spelling out specifically that it's business or personal, but either or would obviously be a good idea. ACSC, ASD, again, produce quick wins for your password manager. Again, not LastPass, not a specific password manager, just use one. So if you're not using one today, definitely worth having a look at that asset. They do have them at their stand. We've pinched a couple and put them on ours as well. But yeah, just good advice, right? I'm all for better password security. I don't really care I do care if you use us, but let's be fair. But honestly, like a lot of the presentations I do, it's like agnostic. I just obviously care about helping people improve security across the board. Little plug for us, just in terms of just high-level use cases, pretty common on the enterprise side. So improving credential management is pretty straightforward, right? Don't use a spreadsheet. Don't share credentials on email. Don't put passwords in an encrypted Excel format, email it, and then 2 minutes later, email the password unencrypted. Probably not a good idea. Pretty common. Phishing attempts. This is a pretty uncommon understanding. So if I send you a dodgy link and it says enter your credential, in most cases, if you're not using a password manager, you will just type it in, right? If you aren't aware that it's a phishing email. With password managers though, they will not autofill to non-trusted websites, right? So not silver bullet. I'm not saying that we're going to protect all phishing emails, but it effectively won't autofill to a non-trusted website that you've saved in LastPass or another password manager. Verizon did a report in 2022, which basically stipulated they did a body of research, and 50% of the users for this company had a reduction in phishing-related attacks by 50% by using a password manager. Again, not us, it's Verizon through their data breach report that they produce every year. Third-party risk has come up a fair amount. So you think about if you're outsourcing any of your IT function, you're allowing access through a credential. How do you do that securely? Use a password manager. Compliance and credential visibility specifically. So in a lot of cases, companies just won't know what's out there, right? Think shadow IT. How do I know what user's using what when? what type of credential are they using, what data are they storing in that application, is it customer data, and is the password admin123, or even worse, SolarWinds123? Yeah, that's obviously a problem, right? So a couple of use cases there for us. There's a whole heap of them, but I won't bore you with that. What are we doing in terms of like passwordless move? So shortly we will be supporting passkeys within LastPass's vault. And so if you think about sort of our trajectory as a business, we're going to manage the legacy long tail of username credentials, and we're also going to manage passkeys in the vault itself. Why is that important? As we sort of shift down on password username sets and move more into passkeys, that's obviously to hedge our bets, fair enough. But passkeys more broadly, typically will get, or the private key will get installed on the OS environment or on the phone or a tablet or a laptop, whatever it might be. And so if you're shifting between devices, it becomes problematic. And even sharing passkeys internally from an enterprise standpoint, at this point is problematic as well. So we'll be doing that as part of the service. Again, not far off. Don't worry about that bit. Password maturity model. So again, we built this out. It's effectively looking at where a company is situated today. Most people are either using maybe a password manager, maybe password manager plus SSO, maybe just SSO as an example. Again, part of this is really to think about, and I can send this to you if you want, no need to take photos, but feel free. And really this asset for us is really to come in and talk to a company about, okay, where are you trying to get to? And if there's a way for us to help you move towards that, we'll provide advice around, what are you using today? Is it a AD environment? Is it workspace? Those type of things to help you sort of manage that as you sort of move up the curve. And the ideal position is you want to get to a position where you're using passkeys across the board because it's more secure, it's a better UX, and realistically that's where it's all heading as we move forward. But again, free asset, it's not gated, right? We'll just send it to you. It's pretty straightforward. Probably ripped through that, but that's okay. QR code, it's not a phishing link. It's just for my LinkedIn profile if you want to reach out and connect. If not, happy to answer any questions you may have, either on the presentations itself or on LastPass. Yeah, happy to answer whatever needs to be answered. Thanks again.
We've got a couple of questions in the app. So one of them is are the algorithms currently used for passkeys quantum resistant? And if not, is there a path to get them to be?
There will be. So FIDO, which is the alliance that basically created the passkey, is looking at that at the moment. Obviously, it's for the most part, it's not, but it's better than a username password.
Depends on your threat model.
Depends on your threat model too.
Yeah. So what happens when biometric and the PIN fails for authentication for a passkey? So I guess what recovery options might exist?
So if you're storing it within a password manager, we've got recovery side on our product. From a passkey, like if it's just a standalone, it is somewhat problematic. It depends on who's providing it too, right? So it's sort of case by case. That's sort of a hard question to answer, just broadly. Yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Potentially a bit of a spicy question. How do we manage the risk of creating a digital honeypot of all our credentials with a third-party password manager? What if there's a breach?
It's a great question. So as you may or may not be aware, we had a security incident. The interesting thing is, like, I've answered most of these questions for the last 2 years. As you may or may not tell, I've got quite a bit more grayer than I used to be. With our incident in particular, if it's kind of directed at that, the actual vault itself was still encrypted. So despite the threat actor, whoever that might be, nation state, we don't really know, there's no evidence to suggest that it's been decrypted. So most providers of password management will run some level of encryption on the vault itself. And so the trade-off really is, do I store passwords in an unencrypted vault, or am I happy to take that position to put everything into a vault, right? We are IRAP assessed. We're also going through a revision of that IRAP at the moment. Local data storage, those type of things are kind of important when you're thinking about that. But again, it's sort of case by case, right? Like, my grandparents probably won't store it in a password manager. They've got like a notebook, but how functional is that for people day to day, right? So it's really just a trade-off. But from our perspective, we've written extensively about our incident. You can see it all on the website, but if there are any other questions, happy to answer them.
I think probably a good takeaway is don't use bad passwords on your password vault.
Correct.
This is just from me. Is there any indication from Microsoft whether or not they'd be integrating passkeys into Active Directory? Because, I mean, if they're not, it doesn't really solve the majority of the problems.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, I think the passkey sort of conversation, I mean, Microsoft at the moment, I think, may have some other things to deal with. But the ideal position is you want to be getting passkeys across the board. So, Gmail has said we're using them, they've deployed it. It makes more sense from an enterprise standpoint to do it as well. But then you have to think about, our major banks as an example, like the log-on process for them is still username password sets. The only one that I've seen from a commercial standpoint locally is Air New Zealand's move to passkeys. But I suspect that that'll ramp up pretty quickly, is my expectation.
Fair enough. Any other questions from the audience? All right, please give it up for Lloyd.
Thank you.